The dust hung thick in the afternoon air, turning the sun into a copper coin that seemed to mock the misery below. Grace Edison stood at the edge of the crowd, her widow's dress already faded from black to the color of old smoke. 6 months pregnant and 6 weeks a widow. She clutched the last thing of value she owned, her wedding ring, and wondered if she'd finally lost her mind. "Step right up. Good people of Millstone." The auctioneer's voice boomed across the town square. "Today we got ourselves something special, a genuine mountain savage and his whelp." The crowd pressed closer, their face twisted with the peculiar mix of disgust and fascination that small towns reserve for their best entertainments. Grace felt her stomach turn, though whether from the baby or the spectacle, she couldn't say. In the center of the square sat an iron cage on a wagon bed. Inside, a man crouched like a cornered wolf. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Beside him, pressed against his side, was a boy no more than 6 years old. The child's eyes were wide and green as bottle glass, darting between the faces of the crowd like he was memorizing each one for some future reckoning. "Abraham Steele here caught these two trying to steal from his smokehouse," the auctioneer continued. "The law says we can't hang him on account of the boy, but Mr. Steele's willing to sell him as bonded labor. Strong back on the man, and the boy'll grow into usefulness soon enough." Grace's hands trembled. She'd seen Abraham Steele's bonded labor before men worked until their bodies gave out, fed just enough to keep them standing, and a child in those hands. $20, someone shouted. 25. The man in the cage lifted his head then, and Grace's breath caught. His eyes weren't wild like she'd expected. They were gray as winter sky and utterly calm, like still water before a stone breaks the surface. Those eyes swept the crowd with a kind of terrible patience, as if he was waiting for something only he could see coming. $30 from Mr. Van Horn, the auctioneer crowed. "Do I hear 35? Samuel Van Horn, Grace's deceased husband's brother, and the reason she now lived in a shack at the edge of town instead of the house her husband had built. Samuel had always looked at her like she was another piece of property he hadn't quite figured out how to claim. The thought of him owning any human being, let alone a child. The boy whimpered, just once, and the man's arm tightened around him. He whispered something in a language Grace didn't recognize, and the child pressed his face into his father's shirt. 35, another voice. William Hurst, who ran the mining operation 2 valleys over. His workers had a tendency to disappear into the mountains, and those who stayed aged 10 years in one. Grace's fingers found the ring. It had been her mother's before it was hers. A simple gold band with 3 small garnets, worth maybe $40 to the right buyer. $40 she desperately needed for food, for shelter, for the baby growing inside her. The baby kicked, hard, right under her ribs. Going once at 35. She thought of her own child, born into a world where their mother couldn't even keep a roof over their head. Then she looked at the boy in the cage, his small fingers wrapped around his father's torn shirt. Going twice. $50. The words tore from her throat before she could stop them. The crowd turned as one. Conversations died like flames doused with water. Even the wind seemed to pause. Well now, the auctioneer's grin showed too many teeth. Mrs. Edison, you got $50. Samuel's face had gone the color of old brick. She doesn't have 50 cents. Jonas, the woman's living on charity. I have this. Grace stepped forward, pulling the ring from her finger. It left a pale band of skin, like a scar that had never quite healed. It's worth 50. You can ask Mr. Goldman at the general store. He offered to buy it last month. Grace. Samuel's voice dropped low and dangerous. You don't know what you're doing. These aren't civilized folk. That man's probably killed. Then why do you want them so badly? The words surprised her as much as anyone. Grace Edison, who'd never talked back to any man in her life, standing in the town square challenging Samuel Van Horn. The auctioneer looked between them, clearly enjoying the drama. Well, Mr. Van Horn, you want to go to 60. Samuel's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. His eyes promised retribution, but he shook his head. Neither Hurst nor any of the other bidders seemed inclined to challenge a pregnant widow for her last possession. Sold. The auctioneer's hammer came down with a crack. To Mrs. Edison for one wedding ring. Value $50. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, like they'd been cheated of a better show. Grace walked to the cage on legs that felt made of water. Up close, she could see the bruises on the man's face, the careful way he held his body like his ribs were cracked. I'm going to unlock this now, she said quietly. Please don't run. I can't chase you. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he said, in perfectly clear English, You should have kept your ring. His voice was rough from disuse, but there was something in it not quite kindness, but a recognition of another human being in pain. Maybe, Grace said. The lock clicked open. What's your name? He hesitated. Then, Lincoln, the boy is Thomas. Not your son. My son. The fierceness in those two words could have melted iron. Grace stepped back as they climbed from the cage. Lincoln moved stiffly, keeping Thomas behind him. The boy peered around his father's leg, and Grace saw what the crowd had missed. The child wasn't looking at them with fear, but with the sharp intelligence of someone taking notes. You have somewhere to go? She asked. Lincoln's laugh was short and bitter. Lady, you just bought 2 prisoners. We go where you tell us. Then you'll come with me. She turned before she could lose her nerve. It's not much, but there's a roof and a fireplace, and no chains. She started walking, not looking back. After a moment, she heard footsteps following. One heavy set, one light as bird bones. The shack sat a mile outside town, where the decent folk wouldn't have to see it. Grace had tried to make it a home wildflowers in a cracked mason jar. Curtains sewn from flour sacks, but poverty has a way of showing through the prettiest dress. This is it, she said unnecessarily. Lincoln surveyed the one-room structure, the patched roof, the door that hung slightly crooked. You live here alone? Yes, your husband. Dead, cave in at the mine. She pushed open the door. Are you hungry? I have beans and... She looked in her near-empty pantry. And beans... Thomas made a small sound that might have been amusement. When Grace looked at him, he held out something in his small fist, a smooth river stone, gray with white veins running through it like tiny rivers. For you, Lincoln said. He likes to collect them. Grace took the stone carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. It's beautiful. Thank you, Thomas. The boy ducked back behind his father, but she caught the ghost of a smile. Why? Lincoln asked suddenly. Grace set the stone on her windowsill, next to the wildflowers. Why what? Why spend your last valuable thing on strangers? She touched her belly, feeling the life moving there. Because I know what it's like to be at the mercy of men who see you as property, and because... She met his winter-gray eyes. Because somebody should have done it for me. Lincoln was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Just once. We'll work for our keep. I can hunt, fix what needs fixing. The boy knows plants, which ones heal, which ones harm. We won't be a burden. I didn't buy you to work for me. Then why? Grace looked at Thomas, who had crept out enough to examine her book, the only one she'd kept. A volume of Shakespeare so worn the binding was more hope than glue. Maybe, she said, I was tired of being alone. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that falls between people who understand something without needing to say it. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the dust-covered world in shades of gold and blood. Tomorrow would bring Samuel's anger, the town's judgment, and empty bellies that 3 people would have to fill instead of 1. But tonight, Grace Edison lit her small fire and heated her last pot of beans. Lincoln showed Thomas how to bank the flames so they'd last through the night. And when the darkness pressed against the thin walls, 3 souls who'd been alone in the world were, for a few hours at least, something almost like family. The stone on the windowsill caught the firelight and seemed to glow, a tiny beacon in a hard world. Grace touched the pale band where her ring used to be and found, to her surprise, that it didn't hurt as much as she'd expected. Some trades, she was beginning to understand, were worth more than gold. The first 3 days passed in a silence so complete it had weight, like wet wool pressing down on everything. Lincoln moved through the small space like smoke, fixing things without being asked. The crooked door now hung straight. The loose floorboard no longer groaned. The chimney that had leaked smoke now drew clean, but he never spoke unless necessity demanded it. And even then, his words were sparse as desert rain. Grace found herself talking to fill the void, then stopping mid-sentence when she realized she was having conversations with herself. Thomas watched everything with those bottle-green eyes, but remained hidden behind his father's presence like a shadow that had learned to think. On the 4th morning, Grace woke to find Lincoln already gone. Panic seized her throat. Had they run, had she been foolish to trust? But Thomas sat by the cold fireplace, arranging his stones in patterns only he understood. "Where's your father?" she asked softly. The boy pointed outside without looking up. Through the window, she saw Lincoln emerging from the tree line, a rabbit hanging from his belt. He moved with the kind of careful conservation that spoke of old injuries held close. When he entered, he set the rabbit on the table and went back out without a word. Grace stared at the animal, realizing she had no idea how to prepare it. In her former life, meat had come from the butcher, clean and ready. She was still staring when Lincoln returned with an armload of wood. He saw her expression and something flickered across his face, not quite amusement, but close. "Never cleaned game," he said. It wasn't a question. No. He picked up the rabbit and motioned to Thomas, who scrambled to his feet. "Come on, boy. Time you learned anyway." They went outside and through the window. Grace watched Lincoln's hands move with practiced efficiency while he explained each step to his son. The boy nodded solemnly, as if preparing a rabbit was the most important knowledge in the world. That night, they ate rabbit stew seasoned with wild herbs Thomas had gathered. It was the best meal Grace had tasted in months. "Thank you," she said. Lincoln nodded and went back to eating, but Thomas looked at her and almost smiled. The days folded into a routine. Lincoln hunted and repaired. Thomas gathered plants and stones. Grace cooked and sewed, trying to stretch their meager resources. They moved around each other like dancers who hadn't yet learned the steps, careful not to touch, not to presume. But the silence began to fray her nerves. She'd been alone before her husband died, but this was different. This was 3 people existing in the same space while occupying different worlds. One evening, as rain drummed on the patched roof, Grace couldn't stand it anymore. "I used to read to my husband," she said suddenly. "Every night after supper. Would you mind if I read aloud?" Lincoln looked up from the trap he was mending. Thomas had gone completely still, like a rabbit sensing danger. "It's just Shakespeare," Grace continued, her words tumbling over each other. "Nothing that needs answering. Just words." Lincoln studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Thomas crept closer as she opened the worn book. "These violent delights have violent ends," she began, "and in their triumph die, like fire and powder." She read for an hour, until her voice grew hoarse. When she stopped, the rain had gentled to a whisper. Thomas had fallen asleep against his father's leg, and Lincoln's hands had stilled on the trap. "My wife," Lincoln said suddenly, his voice rough. "She liked books." It was the first personal thing he'd offered. Grace held her breath, afraid to break whatever spell had made him speak. She died when Thomas was 3. Fever took her. He looked down at his sleeping son. "Haven't heard reading since." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. She was the one who taught me English. I knew some before, but she—" He stopped, as if words were coins he couldn't afford to spend. They sat in silence. But it was different now, softer somehow. The next morning brought trouble in the form of hoofbeats. Grace recognized Samuel's horse before she saw his face. Behind him rode Jonas Fairweather, the sheriff who owed his position to Van Horn money. "Grace." Samuel dismounted, his boots hitting the ground hard. "We need to discuss your recent purchase." Lincoln materialized in the doorway. Thomas behind him. Samuel's hand moved to his gun. "Easy there," Jonas said, though his own hand hovered near his weapon. "We're here peaceful-like." "Are you?" Lincoln's voice was flat as hammered steel. "I'm here to make my sister-in-law a generous offer," Samuel said, never taking his eyes off Lincoln. "Times are hard for a widow. I'll give her $60 for her, property. That's $10 profit for nothing." "They're not property," Grace said. "They're free men." Samuel's laugh was ugly. "Free, you bought them at a slave auction. Woman, that makes them yours to sell." "That wasn't a legal auction, and you know it. Abraham Steele had no right." "Abraham Steele's a respected businessman. You're a pregnant widow living in shame." Samuel stepped closer. "Think carefully. Grace, that baby's going to need things. Food, medicine, a real roof over its head." Grace felt the baby move, as if protesting. "My answer is no." "Then let me make it clearer." Samuel's voice dropped. "That savage probably killed men in the mountains. Maybe women, too. You want that around when your baby comes. You want to wake up one night with his hands around your throat." Lincoln hadn't moved, but something in his stillness changed, became dangerous. Jonas noticed too, his hand dropping to his gun. "Get off my land," Grace said quietly. "Your land," Samuel smiled without humor. "This patch of dirt belongs to whoever pays the taxes, and those come due next month, $40. As I recall, you plan to sell another ring." He turned to go, then paused. "When you come begging, Grace and you will remember I tried to help." His eyes flicked to Lincoln. "Enjoy your time here. Savage, it won't last." They rode away, leaving dust and threats hanging in the air. That night, the silence in the cabin was different, charged with the weight of what was coming. Grace sat by the fire, calculating and recalculating numbers that wouldn't change. $40 for taxes, maybe $5 in her hidden jar. No ring to sell. No miracle coming. Lincoln fed wood to the fire, each movement precise. Thomas had retreated to the corner with his stones, building walls and knocking them down. "He's right," Lincoln said suddenly. Grace looked up. "About what?" "You can't afford to keep us, and we're bringing you trouble." "That's my choice to make." "Is it?" He turned to face her. "What happens when that baby comes and you've got nothing? What happens when Van Horn decides to take what he wants anyway?" "Then I'll face that when it comes." "You're a fool," he said, but there was no heat in it. "Maybe." Grace touched her belly. "But I've been careful my whole life. Obedient, proper. And where did it get me alone in a shack with nothing but beans and books?" She met his eyes. "At least now I'm a fool with company." Something shifted in Lincoln's face. He went outside and returned with something wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it to reveal a piece of wood and a small knife. "Thomas," he said quietly. "Show Mrs. Edison your birds." The boy looked uncertain, but brought over one of his stones. Balanced on top was a tiny wooden bird, no bigger than a walnut, carved with incredible detail. "He makes them," Lincoln said, "trades them sometimes. When we were in the mountains, people in towns, they'd buy them." Grace picked up the bird with reverent hands. Every feather was defined, the eyes alert, wings poised as if it might take flight. "These are beautiful," she breathed. "Thomas, you made this." The boy nodded, the ghost of pride flickering across his face. "If we could get to a bigger town," Lincoln said slowly. Maybe sell enough. The Harvest Festival. Grace interrupted. In Meridian, 3 days' walk. People come from all over. They'd sell. She looked at Lincoln. But Samuel will hear about it. He'll try to stop us. Let him try. It was the first time she'd heard anything like emotion in his voice. Not quite hope, but the shadow of it. That night, Grace read again. Thomas fell asleep to the rhythm of iambic pentameter, and when she closed the book, Lincoln spoke. The stones he collects, each one reminds him of a place we've been. That one, he pointed to a black stone shot with silver. That's from where we camped the night after his mother died. He keeps them so he won't forget. Grace looked at the boy, curled small and trusting against his father's side. And the birds. She taught him to whistle bird calls. Now he carves them instead. Lincoln's hand rested on his son's head, gentle as falling snow. He hasn't spoken since she died. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, wind worried at the patched roof, but inside felt suddenly, impossibly, safe. We'll make this work, Grace said, somehow. Lincoln looked at her across the dying fire. Why do you care what happens to us? She thought about it, her hand finding the pale band where her ring used to be. Because, she said finally, you fix things without being asked. Because your son gives me stones like they're treasures. Because you could have run a dozen times, but you're still here. She paused. And because I think we're all collecting stones, trying not to forget who we were before the world broke us. Lincoln was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, her name was Mary, my wife. She had yellow hair and laughed like birds singing. His voice was rough with the disuse and grief. I want Thomas to remember that, the laughing. Grace nodded, her throat tight. We'll help him remember. The fire died to embers. The wind gentled. And in a broken-down shack at the edge of nowhere, 3 broken people began the slow, careful work of building something that might, if they were very lucky, become whole. The storm arrived without warning on their 10th night together. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and the wind hit the shack like a fist. Grace woke to the sound of wood groaning and rain hammering the roof like bullets. A crash. The patch Lincoln had fixed tore away, and water poured through like a waterfall. Thomas cried out the first sound she'd heard him make and scrambled to his father. Get to the corner, Lincoln shouted over the wind. He grabbed the table and upended it against the wall, creating a small shelter. Grace gathered their few blankets, her hands shaking as much from fear as cold. They huddled together as the storm raged. The walls shook. More patches tore away. Water pooled on the floor, turning their dirt floor to mud. Grace felt the baby kicking hard, as if protesting the chaos. Lincoln disappeared into the storm and returned with boards torn from the lean-to outside. He worked through the night, hammering patches over the worst holes while rain soaked him to the bone. Every time Grace tried to help, he waved her back to Thomas. The boy pressed against her side, trembling. Without thinking, she began to hum an old lullaby her mother had sung. Thomas's shaking slowly eased. Then, so quietly she almost missed it under the storm's roar, he began to hum along. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving devastation in its wake. Half the roof was gone. Their few possessions were soaked. The door hung by one hinge. Lincoln stood in the wreckage, water dripping from his hair. His shirt was torn, and Grace could see bruises from where debris had struck him. He looked at what was left of their shelter, and something broke in his expression. I can't fix this, he said quietly. It was the first time she'd heard defeat in his voice. Thomas tugged at Grace's sleeve. When she looked down, he pressed something into her hand, a smooth river stone, still warm from his palm. For hope, Lincoln translated, though Thomas hadn't spoken. He gives them when... He stopped, unable to finish. Grace closed her fingers around the stone. Then we'll fix it together." "With what?" Lincoln gestured at the destruction. "We have no money, no materials, no—" "We have hands," Grace interrupted. "We have minds, we have stubbornness." She looked at Thomas. "And we have hope stones." For the first time since she'd met him, Lincoln almost smiled. They worked through the day, salvaging what they could. Thomas proved surprisingly helpful. His small hands quick and clever. He sorted nails from the mud, found boards that could be reused, and even discovered their pot, dented but whole, buried under debris. As the sun peaked, unexpected visitors arrived. Clara Barton, the midwife who lived 2 miles east, rode up on her mule. Behind her walked Theodore Roosevelt, the young blacksmith's apprentice, pulling a cart. "Heard the storm hit you hard?" Clara said without preamble. She was a woman built like a fence post, straight, sturdy, and hard to move. "Brought what we could spare." The cart held lumber, a tarp, and Grace's eyes stung a sack of flour and another of beans. "We can't pay," Grace started. "Didn't ask you to." Clara dismounted, studying Lincoln with sharp eyes. "You the mountain man everyone's fussing about?" Lincoln tensed. "I am." Clara looked him up and down like she was evaluating a horse. "You know anything about birthing babies?" "Some." "Good. This one's—" She pointed at Grace's belly, "sitting wrong. I might need extra hands come time." She turned to Theodore. "Help them get that tarp up before the next rain." Theodore, barely 16 and built like he'd been assembled from spare parts, jumped to help. He chattered constantly as they worked, seemingly unbothered by Lincoln's silence. "And Mr. Van Horn's mighty angry about you folks," he said, hammering boards. "Says you're harboring dangerous folk. Course. He also says Mrs. Edison here corrupted his brother's mind with book learning. So—" He shrugged. "My ma says any woman who reads Shakespeare can't be all bad." By afternoon, they had a makeshift roof. It wouldn't last forever, but it would keep the rain out. Clara supervised, ordering everyone around with the authority of someone who delivered half the county. "You," she pointed at Thomas, "you gather yarrow and willow bark. Your PA can show you where." She turned to Grace. "You need to eat more. Baby's too small." "I eat what we have," Grace said quietly. Clara's expression softened slightly. "Theodore, leave that ham from your ma's smokehouse. Don't argue, boy. She sent it special." As they prepared to leave, Clara pulled Grace aside. "That man's running from something." "I know." "You trust him." Grace looked at Lincoln, who was showing Thomas how to identify medicinal plants. "Yes." Clara studied her. "Van Horn's been talking to the marshal in Meridian, making noise about custody laws and proper guardians for orphans." Grace's hand went to her belly. "He can't." "He can try. Man like that, with money and influence." Clara shook her head. "You be careful, girl, and when that baby comes ready, you send the mountain man, day or night." After they left, the shack felt different. Still broken, but somehow less alone. Thomas laid out his new plants to dry, handling them like sacred objects. Lincoln worked on reinforcing the walls, and Grace used some of the precious flour to make bread. That night, as they ate Clara's ham with fresh bread, Thomas did something unexpected. He stood, walked to Grace, and carefully placed his bowl in her hands. Then he went to the corner and returned with one of his carved birds. He set it on the table in front of her and, in a voice rusty from disuse, said, "Thank you." Grace's eyes filled. Lincoln went completely still. "You're welcome," she managed. Thomas nodded solemnly and returned to his seat. He didn't speak again, but something had shifted, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen river. Later, as Thomas slept, Lincoln sat by the fire working on a new carving. Grace watched his hands move, precise and patient. He talked, she said unnecessarily. First time in 2 years. Lincoln's voice was rough. His mother would have... He stopped. Tell me about her. Lincoln was quiet so long Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she was a teacher at the mission school, educated back east, came west to bring learning to the frontier. His hands stilled on the wood. I was hired to guide her to the settlement. Took one look at her trying to ford a creek in city shoes and figured she'd be dead in a week. But she wasn't. No. Strongest woman I ever met, just in different ways. He resumed carving. She saw me struggling with a contract, never learned to read proper, offered to teach me, said it was payment for the guiding. A ghost of a smile. Took her 3 months to teach me letters. Took me 3 minutes to know I'd marry her. What happened? Grace asked softly. We were happy. 5 years. Thomas came, and she said he was our miracle. Then the fever hit the settlement. She spent 2 days nursing others before it took her too. His hands tightened on the wood. I couldn't save her. All my mountain knowledge, all my strength, and I couldn't save her. Grace understood that helplessness. She'd felt it watching her husband leave for the mine that last morning, complaining of a headache. Felt it when they brought his body home. She'd have liked you, Lincoln said suddenly. Mary, she'd have liked that you read to Thomas, that you don't look at him like he's broken. He's not broken, Grace said firmly. He's careful. There's a difference. Lincoln looked at her across the fire. So are you. What? Careful. You've been hurt before. Not just your husband dying. Before that. Grace touched her belly unconsciously. My father thought education ruined women for marriage. When he found my books, she shrugged. He burned them. Said no man wanted a wife who thought she was smarter than him. Were you smarter than your husband? The question surprised her. Yes, she admitted. But James didn't mind. Said he liked having someone to talk to about more than crops and weather. She smiled sadly. Samuel hated that. Said I put ideas in James's head. Like what? Like maybe miners deserved fair wages. Like maybe the company store shouldn't charge double what goods cost elsewhere. Like maybe a man's worth wasn't measured by how much money he could squeeze from others. Dangerous ideas, Lincoln said. But there was approval in his voice. Got him killed, maybe. He was organizing the miners to demand better conditions when the cave-in happened. Samuel said it was God's judgment. Her voice turned bitter. Then he tried to take the house. Said a woman couldn't manage property. Judge agreed until he found out about the baby. Said he'd revisit after it was born. So you ran. So I ran. She looked around the broken shack. To this palace. It's fixable, Lincoln said. Most things are. With time. They sat in comfortable silence. The fire crackled. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness. Thomas stirred in his sleep, mumbling something that might have been words. The festival, Grace said eventually. It's in 2 weeks. If we can make enough birds, maybe some of your other carvings. We'll need a cart, and Van Horn will be watching. Then we'll go around him. Clara knows people. Theodore's mother, too, mountain people who don't care for Van Horn's type. Lincoln nodded slowly. It could work, but Grace, he met her eyes. If something goes wrong, if Van Horn makes his move, you take the money and go. Don't wait for us. No. Grace. No. She stood, surprising herself with her vehemence. We're in this together, all of us. That's what family does. The word hung between them like a challenge. Lincoln stared at her, something unreadable in his expression. We're not family, he said finally. Aren't we? Grace demanded. We share food, shelter, troubles. Thomas gave me a hope stone. You spent all night in a storm keeping us safe. If that's not family, then what is? Lincoln had no answer. Or maybe he did, but couldn't speak it yet. Instead, he handed her the carving he'd been working on, a woman reading to a child. every line perfect and true. "For the baby," he said gruffly. "So they know their mother gave up her ring for strangers. So they know what kind of person they come from." Grace held the carving like it was made of spun gold and promises. Outside, the wind tested their new repairs, but the roof held, the fire burned steady, and Thomas, still sleeping, smiled at whatever dreams visited children who were learning, slowly, to trust again. The stone in Grace's pocket seemed to pulse with warmth. Hope, Thomas had called it, looking at the man and boy who'd stumbled into her life through an iron cage. Grace thought maybe the child was wiser than any of them. Hope was heavy sometimes. It required feeding, tending, protecting from storms. But it was warm, too. And on cold nights in broken places, warmth mattered more than weight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Van Horn schemes, empty bellies, a baby growing despite their poverty. But tonight, in a patched-together shack that shouldn't feel like home, but did, 3 people who'd started as strangers practiced being family. And sometimes, practice was enough to make it real. The mornings had taken on a rhythm. Lincoln rose before dawn, moving silent as smoke to check his snares. Thomas followed soon after, his small basket ready for the day's gathering. Grace would find them by the creek when she woke, the boy showing his father which plants Clara had asked for while Lincoln cleaned whatever small game he'd caught. It had been 2 weeks since the storm, and their strange household had found its pattern. But this morning was different. This morning, Lincoln was teaching Thomas to fish. Grace watched from the doorway as Lincoln fashioned a pole from a willow branch, his large hands gentle as he showed Thomas how to tie the line. The boy's face was fierce with concentration, tongue poking out slightly as he worked the knot. "Like this." Thomas's voice was still rare enough that each word felt like a gift. "Almost. Here." Lincoln adjusted the boy's fingers. "The rabbit goes around the tree. Remember?" They'd been working on trust, the 3 of them, small steps. Thomas spoke now, though only a few words a day. Lincoln had started leaving his knife on the table instead of always at his belt, and Grace had told them about the baby's father, not her dead husband, but a traveling merchant who'd promised marriage until he'd learned about the child. "I was already a month along when James offered to marry me," she'd admitted one night. "He knew, said it didn't matter, that he'd raise it as his own. Then the cave-in." She'd shrugged. "Samuel knows the truth. It's another weapon he'll use if he can." Lincoln had simply nodded and gone back to his carving. Thomas had given her another stone. Neither had looked at her differently, and that acceptance had broken something loose in her chest. Now she walked down to the creek, carrying the breakfast she'd made from their slowly improving stores. Theodore had been by twice more with extras from his mother, and Clara sent herbs with anyone passing their way. "Catch anything?" she asked. Thomas held up a small trout, grinning. It was the first full smile she'd seen from him. "He's a natural," Lincoln said. There was pride in his voice, warm and unexpected. "Must get it from his mother's side. Ma hated fish," Thomas said, then looked stricken, as if mentioning her was forbidden. "Did she?" Grace sat carefully on a fallen log, her growing belly making movement awkward. "What did she like?" Thomas glanced at his father, who nodded. "Berries. She liked berries, and singing, and—" He paused, thinking, "and when Pa read to her at night." "I didn't know you could read," Grace said to Lincoln. "Not well, but Mary made sure I learned. Said a man should be able to read contracts so he doesn't get cheated." His mouth quirked. "Too bad I didn't learn numbers as well." They ate by the creek, the morning sun painting the water gold. Thomas chattered about the fish, about the eagle he'd seen, about the den he'd found that might have foxes. It was the most Grace had heard him speak, and she treasured each word. After breakfast, Lincoln surprised her. "I made something," he said, looking uncomfortable. "For the work." He led her behind the shack to where he'd been laboring in secret. There, gleaming in the morning light, was a wooden carrying yoke, carved smooth and balanced perfectly. "For water," he explained. "Clara said you shouldn't lift heavy things. This way." He demonstrated, setting the yoke across his shoulders. Weights distributed. Easier on the body. Grace touched the wood, seeing the hours of work in every curve. Small vines were carved along its length, delicate and beautiful. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's practical," he said gruffly, but his ears reddened. That afternoon brought the first test of their growing trust. A rider approached not Samuel or Jonas, but a stranger in a federal marshal's coat. Grace's heart hammered as she recognized him from town Winston Churchill, newly appointed and still trying to prove himself. Lincoln tensed, hand moving instinctively toward where his knife usually sat. It wasn't there. "Mrs. Edison." The marshal dismounted, his young face trying for authority. "I'm here on official business." "What kind of business?" Grace kept her voice steady. "There's been a complaint about the men you're housing." He glanced at Lincoln, who stood perfectly still. "Samuel Van Horn says they're vagrants, possible criminals. He's concerned for your safety." "As you can see, I'm perfectly safe." "Ma'am, I need to ask this man some questions." Churchill turned to Lincoln. "Your name?" "Lincoln, full name." Lincoln's jaw tightened. "Just Lincoln." "I see. And where are you from?" "The mountains." Churchill frowned. "I need more than that. Where were you born? Do you have papers? Proof of citizenship?" "Do you?" Lincoln asked quietly. The marshal's face flushed. "I'm not the one under suspicion." "Of what?" Grace stepped forward. "What exactly is he suspected of?" "Marshal Churchill, working, hunting, fixing my roof." "There's been trouble in the mountain settlements, attacks on mining camps, stolen supplies. And you think one man and a 6-year-old boy are responsible?" "I think," Churchill said slowly, "that a man without a past is hiding something." Thomas appeared then, drawn by voices. He took one look at the marshal's badge and fled behind his father. The fear in his movement was so stark that Churchill stepped back. "What happened to the boy?" he asked. "Life," Lincoln said flatly. "Life happened." They stood in tense silence. Then Grace did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She laughed. "Marshal, do you know what I see when I look at this man? I see someone who works from dawn to dusk, who teaches his son to fish, who spent a night in a storm fixing my roof, who carved toys for a baby not even born yet." She met Churchill's eyes. "If that's criminal behavior, then arrest him. But you'll have to arrest me too, because I'm guilty of giving them shelter." Churchill looked between them, clearly out of his depth. He was young, maybe 25, still believing the world divided neatly into right and wrong. "The boy needs schooling," he said finally. "It's the law." "School doesn't start until harvest is done," Grace said. "And when it does, Thomas will attend." "Will he?" Churchill looked at Lincoln. "Or will you run the first time someone looks at you sideways?" "We're not running," Lincoln said. The words seemed to surprise him. Churchill studied them all for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Van Horn won't like this." "Van Horn doesn't have to," Grace said. "No, but he has influence, and money, and friends in high places." The marshal mounted his horse. "I'll report that I found no evidence of criminal activity. But Mrs. Edison, be careful. Men like Van Horn don't give up easy." After he left, they stood in silence. Thomas crept out from behind his father, clutching a new stone black and smooth as worry. "You could have told him," Lincoln said quietly, "about the auction, how we came here. That wasn't a legal auction. You weren't legal prisoners. And even if you were," Grace met his eyes, "you're not anymore. You're my She paused, searching for words. You're mine. Something passed over Lincoln's face, surprise. Maybe, or recognition. Yours, he repeated. Mine to protect, mine to stand with, mine to... She touched her belly. Mine to call family, if you'll let me. Thomas tugged at her skirt. When she looked down, he pressed the worry stone into her hand, but then he smiled and gave her another white as milk, smooth as hope. 2 stones, she asked. 1 for worry, Thomas said solemnly. 1 for after worry is done. That evening, Lincoln disappeared into his workshop, a lean-to he'd built beside the shack. When he emerged, he carried something wrapped in cloth. For the festival, he said, unwrapping it carefully. Grace gasped. It was a carving of a woman reading to 2 children, one in her arms, one beside her. But the woman's face, it was her face, captured in wood with impossible tenderness. Every line spoke of strength and kindness and fierce protection. Lincoln, she breathed. It's not finished. The detail work needs... He stopped, seeing her tears. What's wrong? Nothing. Everything. She wiped her eyes. It's beautiful. But it's not true. I'm not this noble. I'm scared most of the time. I don't know what I'm doing. You stood between us and a marshal, Lincoln said quietly. You gave your last valuable thing for strangers. You make Thomas smile. He paused. You read to us at night and make this broken place feel whole. Grace looked at the carving again, trying to see herself through his eyes. The woman in the wood wasn't perfect. There were worry lines around her eyes, a stubbornness to her jaw. But she was strong, unbreakable. Keep it, Lincoln said, for courage. That night, as Thomas arranged his stones in new patterns and Lincoln sharpened tools for tomorrow's work, Grace read to them from Shakespeare, but her mind kept drifting to the carving, to the way Lincoln's hands had shaped her face from memory. After Thomas fell asleep, Lincoln spoke into the comfortable darkness. My full name is Abraham Lincoln. My wife gave me the second name, said the first President Lincoln would bring freedom to many, and maybe I could bring freedom to a few. He laughed bitterly. Instead, I got her killed chasing a dream of land and safety. You didn't kill her. Fever did. I brought her to that settlement. I thought... He paused. I thought we could build something. A place where Thomas could grow up free, where being half-blood wouldn't matter. Grace's breath caught. She'd suspected, but hadn't asked. His mother's people. Shoshone. Her grandfather was a chief. Her father was a trader who left before she was born. Lincoln's voice was steady, but she heard old pain underneath. The mission school took her in, taught her white ways. She could pass, mostly, but Thomas is perfect, Grace said firmly. The world won't see it that way. Then we'll teach the world to see better. Lincoln was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, the marshal was right about the raids. It was me. After Mary died, after they wouldn't let me bury her in the town cemetery because of her blood, I took Thomas and went wild, stole what we needed, scared off anyone who came too close. I told myself it was survival, but really... He paused. Really, I was just angry. What changed? Thomas gave someone a stone, a trader woman who shared her fire with us. He hadn't given stones to anyone but Mary before. Lincoln's voice softened. I realized I was teaching him to hate. Mary she would have been so disappointed. Grace reached across the darkness and found his hand. It was calloused and strong and trembled slightly at her touch. She would be proud, Grace said, of both of you. They sat in silence, hands barely touching. While outside the coyotes sang and the wind tested their repairs, the carving sat on the table, watching over them with wooden eyes full of faith they were still learning to deserve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The festival was coming, and with it the chance for hope or disaster. Van Horn was plotting, The marshal was watching, and Grace's baby grew stronger every day, demanding space in a world that might not welcome it. But tonight, in their patched-together home, they had full bellies and dry beds and stories shared in darkness. Thomas had given 2 stones worry and its aftermath. Lincoln had given his true name. And Grace had given a promise mine to protect, mine to stand with, mine to call family. The carrying yoke stood by the door, waiting for morning's work. Carved birds lined the windowsill like guardians. And somewhere in the space between stranger and family, 3 broken people continued the patient work of becoming whole. The hope stone gleamed white in the darkness, a small moon in Grace's palm. She closed her fingers around it and chose to believe in tomorrow, in possibility, in the family you build from whatever pieces the world leaves you. It was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. The news came with Theodore on a gray morning when the sky pressed down like a flat iron. He burst through their door without knocking, face flushed from running. "They're coming," he gasped. "Mr. Van Horn and Sheriff Fairweather, they got papers from Judge Carnegie." Grace's hand went to her belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing trouble. "What kind of papers?" "Custody papers. For Thomas." Theodore glanced at the boy, who'd gone still as a deer scenting wolves. "Says his pa's an unfit guardian. Says the boy needs Christian raising in a proper home." Lincoln stood slowly, and Grace saw the mountain man emerge, the one who'd survived by being harder than the wilderness itself. "When?" "Tomorrow. Maybe day after. My ma heard it from Mrs. Rockefeller at the general store. They're bringing deputies from Meridian. 6 men? Maybe more." 6 men for 1 child, Grace said bitterly. "How brave of them." Theodore shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. Van Horn's been spreading stories. Says that you and Lincoln..." He couldn't finish, his young face burning red. "That I'm a fallen woman," Grace finished, "living in sin with a savage. Ma says to tell you she doesn't believe a word. Neither does Mrs. Roosevelt or Clara or half the decent folk. But the other half..." He shrugged helplessly. Lincoln moved to the window, studying the horizon like he could see the threat forming. "We should run, tonight." "No," Grace's voice was steel. "We run now. We run forever. Thomas deserves better than that. Better than being taken." Lincoln turned, and she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for his son. "You don't know what they do to half-blood children in those Christian homes. They beat the Indian out of them, cut their hair, forbid their language. Thomas would..." He stopped, unable to voice it. "Then we fight," Grace said. 6 men, Grace, with guns, with the law behind them." "The law?" She laughed, short and bitter. "The same law that let them auction you like cattle? The same law that says I can't own property because I'm a woman. That law." Theodore cleared his throat. "My ma says to tell you there's another way. Maybe." They turned to him. "The festival starts day after tomorrow, if you were there. In public, with witnesses. Lot harder to steal a child in front of a crowd. And Mrs. Barton Clara, she's got influence with the church ladies. If they vouch for you as good Christians..." "But we're not," Lincoln said flatly. "Christians." "Could be," Theodore said. "I mean, if you wanted Reverend Douglas, he's not like the others. He says God loves everybody, even..." He stopped, embarrassed. "Even savages." Lincoln's voice was dry. "Even anybody." Theodore finished firmly. He married a Chinese woman last year when nobody else would. Said love was love in God's eyes. Grace looked at Lincoln. A fake conversion felt like another cage. But if it kept Thomas safe, there's something else, Theodore added reluctantly. "Van Horn knows about the festival, too. He'll be watching for you." After Theodore left, they sat in heavy silence. Thomas had retreated to his corner, building walls with his stones higher than usual. Grace noticed. "We need help," she said finally. Lincoln laughed, but there was no humor in it. "From who we're outcasts, Grace, you, me, Thomas. We're everything this town fears." "Not everyone in town." She stood, decision made. "I'm going to Clara's." "Grace." "I'm going. You prepare what we need for the festival. All the carvings, everything." She pulled on her shawl, and Lincoln teach Thomas to run, just in case. The walk to Clara's took an hour. By the time Grace arrived, her back ached and the baby was performing acrobatics. Clara took one look at her and pulled her inside. "Sit, now." She pressed a cup of tea into Grace's hands. "You look ready to drop." "They're coming for Thomas." Clara's face hardened. "I heard, damn fools, that boy's better off with his father than any Christian home I know." "We need help. Clara, I don't know where else to turn." Clara studied her for a long moment. Then she stood and went to a cabinet, pulling out a leather portfolio. "My late husband was a lawyer," she said. "Before the drink took him, I kept his books, learned a thing or two." She opened the portfolio. "There's precedent. Natural parents have rights, even Indian ones, especially if they can prove stability. Income, community support. We have none of those things." "Don't you?" Clara pulled out paper and began writing. "You have shelter. You have food. The man hunts and trades. You take in sewing when you can. That's income." She kept writing. "As for community support..." She stood and went to the door, calling to someone outside. Within minutes, her kitchen was filling with women. Mrs. Roosevelt, the baker's wife, Mrs. Nightingale, who ran the boarding house, even Mrs. Carnegie, the judge's young wife who rarely spoke above a whisper. "Ladies," Clara announced, "we have a situation." Grace watched in amazement as Clara laid out the case. The women listened, faces growing harder with each detail. 6 men, Mrs. Roosevelt said, "for one little boy. Shameful. Samuel Van Horn's had too much say in this town too long." Mrs. Nightingale added, "Time someone stood up." "My husband," Mrs. Carnegie began, then stopped. "Your husband follows the law," Clara said gently. "We just need to make sure he follows all of it, including the parts that protect families." They spent the afternoon planning. Letters were written, character references for Lincoln and Grace. Mrs. Carnegie promised to speak to her husband about proper procedure. Mrs. Nightingale offered her boarding house as neutral ground if needed. "The festival," Clara said finally. "You'll set up with the church ladies, right between my herb stand and Mrs. Roosevelt's bakery. Van Horn won't dare make a scene there." "But we're not." "You're good people in need," Clara interrupted. "That's Christian enough for me." As Grace prepared to leave, Clara pulled her aside. "That baby's dropped. You're closer than you think." "I know," Grace touched her belly. "I just need a few more days. Until after the festival. Until Thomas is safe. Babies don't wait for convenient times." Clara pressed a packet of herbs into her hands. "If pains start, brew this. It'll slow things. But Grace, don't wait too long to send for me." The walk home was harder. The baby felt impossibly heavy, pressing down with each step. Halfway there, she had to stop, gripping a tree as pain rippled across her belly. "Not now," she thought fiercely. "Not yet." The pain passed, and she continued walking. But she could feel time running out, as surely as she could feel Van Horn's net closing around them. When she reached the shack, she found Lincoln teaching Thomas to hide. They'd built a false bottom in the wood bin, just big enough for a small boy. "If I whistle like this," Lincoln demonstrated, a low, mournful sound like wind through pines. "You hide, no matter what. Understand?" Thomas nodded solemnly. Like when the bear came. Exactly like that. Grace told them about Clara's plan, the women's support, the festival strategy. Lincoln listened without comment, but she saw hope war with skepticism in his eyes. They're risking their reputations for us, he said finally. Yes. Why? Grace thought about it. Because they're tired too. Tired of men like Van Horn deciding who matters, tired of pretending wrong is right because it's legal. She met his eyes. And because some of them know what it's like to have their children threatened. That night, they prepared for the festival with desperate efficiency. Lincoln had been carving for weeks birds, deer, horses, even a miniature wolf pack that seemed to run even while standing still. Thomas wrapped each piece carefully in cloth while Grace sewed pockets into her shawl to hide their meager savings. If something happens, Lincoln said quietly, if they take me, you get Thomas to Clara. She'll know what to do. Nothing's going to happen. Grace, he caught her hand. Promise me, if it comes to choosing, you choose Thomas. He's what matters. You both matter. She squeezed his hand. We all matter. Later, as Thomas slept, they sat by the dying fire. The night was too quiet, as if the world held its breath. I was married before, Lincoln said suddenly. Before Mary. Grace waited. Arranged by my mother's people. I was 16, she was 14. We were strangers trying to be what everyone expected. He stared into the flames. She died, birthing our son. He lived 3 days. His voice was steady, but Grace heard years of guilt. I thought I'd never... Mary was the first person who saw me. Not what I represented. White woman choosing a half-breed, it was scandal. But she said I was the first man who listened when she talked about ideas instead of just nodding. She sounds remarkable. She was, but so are you. He looked at her. Different, but the same in ways that matter. Strong in the broken places. Grace felt tears threaten. I'm not strong. I'm terrified. Same thing sometimes. They sat in silence, hands almost touching. Finally, Grace spoke. My father picked my first husband. Good family, good prospects. Beat me twice before the wedding for reading books. I ran the night before the ceremony. Traveled west with a family heading to California. Met James in Independence when their wagon broke. She smiled sadly. He was fixing their wheel, covered in grease, and he quoted Shakespeare at me. She is beautiful, and therefore to be wooed. I laughed for the first time in months. You loved him. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I loved what he let me be, myself. That was gift enough. Lincoln turned her hand over, tracing the calluses that months of hard work had built. What do you want now after all this? Safety, peace, a place Thomas can grow up without fear. A place my baby can be born into kindness instead of judgment. She met his eyes. What do you want? Time, he said simply. Time to see Thomas become a man. Time to... He stopped. What? Time to deserve the faith you have in us. Grace's heart clenched. You already do. He shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. For tomorrow, he said, placing it in her hand. It was a carving no bigger than her thumb, a woman holding a baby. With a man and the boy beside her, a family. The detail was impossibly fine. Hours of work in something that could fit in her palm. If they take us, he said quietly. If the worst happens. Remember you gave us these weeks of being people instead of problems. It matters. Even if it ends tomorrow, it mattered. It's not ending, Grace said fiercely. We're going to that festival. We're going to sell every carving. The church ladies will vouch for us. Judge Carnegie will follow the law. And we're going to come home together. You believe that? She closed her fingers around the carving. I have to... That night, she barely slept. Every sound could be horses. Every shadow could be Van Horn's men. The baby was restless, pressing and turning like it too sensed the coming storm. Just before dawn, Thomas crept to her side. Without words, he pressed a stone into her hand. This one was different, smooth and round like a river stone, but with a hole worn through its center. For seeing through, he whispered. Through what? Through the scary to the other side. Grace pulled him close. This small boy who'd seen too much but still believed in seeing through. Lincoln joined them, and for a moment they sat together, a family in all but law, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. The sun rose red as blood, painting their small home in shades of warning, but inside, wrapped in the fierce love of chosen bonds. They held each other and refused to be afraid. Today would bring the festival. Van Horn, 6 men with guns and papers saying wrong was right. But it would also bring Clara and her army of church ladies, Theodore and his mother, Reverend Douglas, who believed love was love, Mrs. Carnegie, who spoke in whispers but might roar when pushed. And it would bring them Grace and Lincoln and Thomas standing together in the town square, refusing to be separated by anything as small as law or prejudice or fear. The seeing-through stone caught the morning light, casting tiny rainbows on the wall. Grace clutched it tight and chose to believe in the other side. They would need every scrap of faith before the day was done. The night before the festival, Grace couldn't sleep. The baby pressed heavy and low, sending waves of discomfort through her body. She rose quietly, not wanting to wake Lincoln or Thomas, and stepped outside into the cool darkness. The stars were brilliant, unmarred by clouds. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the life within respond with a strong kick. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, not yet." A movement in the shadows made her heart jump. But it was only Lincoln. He moved beside her, silent as always. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Planning." He gazed toward town. "Van Horn won't wait for the festival. He'll try to take Thomas before we get there. Then we leave before dawn. Take the long way, through the woods." "That's what I'm thinking." He paused. "Grace, I need you to know something. These weeks with you, they've been the closest to peace I've felt since Mary died." Grace's throat tightened. "Don't say it like a goodbye." "Not goodbye, just—" He turned to her, and in the starlight she could see the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "Thank you for seeing us as people, for giving Thomas hope again, for—" She stopped him with a touch to his arm. "We're going to get through this. All of us." He covered her hand with his. "Your faith could move mountains. Then it's enough to move a few small-minded men." They stood in silence, hands joined, while the night wind whispered promises or warnings, it was hard to tell which. Then Grace gasped, doubling over as pain rippled through her. "Grace?" "I'm fine, just— the baby's restless." But she could feel the truth in her body. Time was running out in more ways than one. Lincoln helped her inside, his touch gentle but worried. "Should I get Clara?" "No, not yet. We need tomorrow. We need the festival." She gripped his hand as another wave passed. "Promise me something." "What?" "If the baby comes tomorrow, if I can't, promise you'll take care of it. You and Thomas, promise you'll be its family." "Grace." "Promise." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then I promise, but you'll be there. You're stronger than you know." They sat by the dying fire until the pain eased. Thomas stirred in his sleep, mumbling something that sounded like Mama. Grace wondered if he dreamed of Mary, or if somewhere in his small heart, he was making room for her too. Just before dawn, they prepared to leave. Grace tucked the carved family into her bodice, close to her heart. Thomas wore his best clothes, patched but clean. Lincoln had even trimmed his hair and beard, looking almost respectable except for the wildness that never quite left his eyes. They took the forest path, Lincoln leading with Thomas on his shoulders. Grace followed, each step an effort. The baby had dropped even lower, and she could feel her body preparing for what was coming. Halfway to town, Lincoln suddenly stopped, his head tilted, listening. "What is it?" Grace whispered.
"Horses coming fast!"
They melted into the underbrush just as 6 riders thundered past on the main road. Van Horn led them, his face set with determination. Sheriff Fairweather rode beside him, looking uncomfortable but committed. After they passed, Lincoln whispered, "They're heading to the shack." "They'll find it empty. And then they'll come to town angry." He looked at her. "We could still run. I know places in the mountains." "No." Grace struggled to her feet. "We face this. In daylight. With witnesses." They reached the edge of town as the sun painted the sky pink and gold. The festival was already stirring to life, vendors setting up stalls, children running between wagons, the smell of fresh bread and coffee floating on the air. Clara spotted them first. She strode over, took one look at Grace, and muttered something unladylike.
"How far apart?"
she demanded. "I'm fine," Grace insisted. "How far?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Clara's face went grim. "All right, we do this fast." She turned to Lincoln. "Set up there, between my stall and Mrs. Roosevelt's. I'll get the others." Within minutes, they were surrounded by a protective wall of church ladies. Mrs. Roosevelt pressed fresh bread into their hands. Mrs. Nightingale draped a colorful cloth over their simple table. Mrs. Carnegie appeared with her husband, the judge looking stern but not unkind. "I've reviewed the law," Judge Carnegie said quietly. "Custody requires proof of unfitness. Poverty alone isn't enough, nor is race, despite what some might wish." He met Lincoln's eyes. "Can you provide for the boy?" "I've provided for 6 years." "And will you allow him to attend school church?" Lincoln glanced at Grace, then nodded. "Yes." "Then legally, I see no grounds for removal." The judge paused. "But Van Horn has other judges in his pocket, friends in high places. This won't end today." Before Lincoln could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the square. Van Horn and his men had returned, faces dark with anger. They pushed through the crowd, heading straight for Lincoln's stall. "There," Van Horn pointed. "Arrest that man." Sheriff Fairweather looked uncomfortable. "On what charges?" "Kidnapping. That boy belongs in proper care." "The boy belongs with his father," Clara said loudly. Several women murmured agreement. Van Horn's face went red. "You don't understand. That man's dangerous. He's been raiding—" "I've been hunting," Lincoln interrupted calmly. "Trading. Working. Nothing illegal."
"You're a savage," Van Horn spat. "Living with a woman without marriage, teaching that boy heathen ways."
"Actually," Reverend Douglas stepped forward. "They came to me last week about marriage. I'll be performing the ceremony after harvest." Grace's eyes widened. Lincoln's face remained carefully neutral. It was a lie, but a clever one.
That's not—"
Van Horn spluttered. "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Van Horn?" The Reverend's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. The crowd was growing, drawn by the drama. Grace recognized faces, some friendly, some hostile, most simply curious. She felt another pain building and gripped the table edge. "This isn't over," Van Horn said. "That boy deserves better than a father who loves him, Mrs." Roosevelt interrupted. "Look at that child. Samuel Van Horn. Does he look abused, neglected?" All eyes turned to Thomas, who stood pressed against Lincoln's leg. Theodore appeared from nowhere, moving to stand beside his friend. Then another child joined them, and another. Soon, Thomas was surrounded by a small army of children, all staring at Van Horn with solemn eyes. "The children know," Mrs. Nightingale said. They always know who's safe and who isn't. Grace wanted to smile at the sight, but pain crashed through her, stealing her breath. She must have made a sound because Lincoln was suddenly beside her. Grace. I'm all right. But she wasn't all right. She could feel wetness spreading. Knew her waters had broken. Oh. Clara took one look and went into action. Mrs. Roosevelt, mind the stall. Mrs. Nightingale, I need your boarding house now. She turned to Lincoln. Carry her, quickly. No, Grace gripped Lincoln's arm. Not until this is finished. Not until Thomas is safe. Grace, the baby. The baby can wait 5 more minutes. She straightened, facing Van Horn despite the pain. You want to know what's best for Thomas? I'll tell you. Love is best. Family is best. And family isn't about blood or skin color or what the law says. It's about showing up. It's about fixing roofs in storms and teaching fishing and giving hope stones when the world feels dark. Another pain crashed through her, and she couldn't hold back a cry. Lincoln caught her as her knees buckled. Her lips stayed silent for long. She gasped, remembering nights of wordless communication, of trust built in glances and gentle touches, until his body showed her the truth she craved. She looked up at Lincoln, seeing in his eyes the same truth she'd been too careful to name. The truth that love doesn't need words. It needs actions. And every action you've taken has said what your voice couldn't. Grace! His voice broke. I love you, she said simply. I love Thomas. We're family. And no piece of paper can change that. The square had gone silent. Even Van Horn seemed struck dumb. Then Judge Carnegie stepped forward. Sheriff Fairweather, he said formally, I see no grounds for removing this child from his father's care. Any attempt to do so without proper legal process will be met with charges of kidnapping. He looked at Van Horn. Is that clear? Van Horn's face was purple with rage, but he nodded stiffly. Furthermore, the judge continued, any harassment of this family will be considered a breach of peace, Mr. Van Horn. I suggest you find other concerns to occupy your time. Clara tugged at Lincoln. Now! She needs to go now! But Grace had one more thing to say. She pulled the carved family from her bodice, holding it high for all to see. This is what we are, she said, her voice carrying across the square. A family carved from hardship, shaped by kindness, polished by love, and no force on earth can break what we've built. Then the pain took her completely, and she knew nothing but Lincoln's arms carrying her. Thomas's frightened voice, and Clara's steady commands. The boarding house room spun around her. Voices faded in and out. She heard Lincoln arguing with someone he wanted to stay. They said it wasn't proper. He said to hell with proper. Let him stay, she gasped. Please. Clara looked scandalized but nodded. Just him. The boy waits outside. Hours blurred together. Pain came in waves, each stronger than the last. Lincoln held her hand, his presence an anchor in the storm. Sometimes she squeezed so hard she was sure she must be breaking his fingers, but he never complained. Talk to me, she begged during a brief respite. About what? Anything. Your voice. It helps. So he talked. He told her about the mountains, about teaching Thomas to track deer, about Mary's laugh, about the first time he saw Grace at the auction and somehow knew she would change everything. I was so angry, he said softly. At the world, at God, at myself. Then you stood there with your last valuable thing, ready to trade it for strangers. And I thought maybe the world hadn't gone completely dark after all. It hasn't, Grace gasped as another pain built. There's light. You just have to look for it. I found it, he said, in you. The final stage came with the setting sun. Grace was exhausted, wrung out, but Lincoln never left her side. His voice guided her through each push. His hands steadied her. His presence reminded her she wasn't alone. Then,
With a cry that seemed to split the world open, the baby arrived.
"A girl," Clara announced, placing the squalling infant on Grace's chest. Small but fierce, like her mother. Grace looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect. Then she looked at Lincoln, seeing wonder in his eyes.
"Want to hold her?"
His hands shook as he took the baby. For a long moment, he just stared. Then the baby opened her eyes gray as winter sky, like his, and he smiled. A real smile, transforming his face. "She's beautiful," he whispered. The door cracked open, and Thomas peered in. Theodore had kept him company through the long hours, but worry was written on every line of his small face. "Come meet your sister," Lincoln said. Thomas crept forward, eyes wide. He studied the baby solemnly, then reached into his pocket. "For her," he said, placing a tiny white stone on the blanket. "A beginning stone." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "What should we call her?" "Mary," Thomas said immediately. "For Mama, so she's not forgotten." Lincoln's eyes glistened. "Mary Grace," he said, "for both her mothers." "Mary Grace," Grace repeated, testing the name. "Yes." Later, when Clara had shooed everyone out to let Grace rest, she found she couldn't sleep. The room was too quiet after the chaos of the day. Then the door opened, and Lincoln slipped in. "Clara will have my hide," he said. "I don't care." She shifted, making room. "I need you here." He sat carefully on the bed's edge.
"Van Horn won't give up. This was just the first battle."
"I know." Grace touched the baby's downy head. "But we won today. Thomas is safe. Mary Grace is here. We stood in front of the whole town and declared ourselves family." She met his eyes. "That matters." "The Reverend lied for us about the marriage. Maybe it doesn't have to be a lie." Lincoln went still. "Grace, I know this started as necessity, but somewhere between that first night and now, it became choice. My choice. Every day. I choose you and Thomas. I choose this family we've built." She took a breath. "If you'll have me, I choose to make it real." He was quiet for so long she feared she'd ruined everything. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle as butterfly wings. "I chose you the day you gave up your ring," he said. "I just didn't have the words. And now I have words and actions and time to prove them both." He smiled, that rare, transforming expression. "Marry me, Grace, not for the law or the town or Van Horn. For us, for our children, for the truth we both know but we're too careful to speak." "Yes," she said simply. Thomas appeared in the doorway. Drawn by some instinct, he climbed onto the bed, careful of the baby, and curled between them. Within minutes, he was asleep. "Our son," Grace said, testing the words. "Our son," Lincoln agreed. "Our daughter, our family." Outside, the festival continued, music and laughter drifting through the window, but inside, in a borrowed room that felt more like home than any place had in years, a family that had begun with an auction and a widow's last ring settled into their new shape. Grace thought of all the stones Thomas had given her. Worry stones and hope stones, beginning stones and seeing through stones, each one a small promise that connection didn't require blood or law or even words. Sometimes it just required showing up. Staying when leaving would be easier. Building something beautiful from broken pieces. The baby stirred, making small sounds. Lincoln hummed something low and wordless, a melody that might have been Shoshone or might have been pure instinct. Thomas smiled in his sleep, and Grace closed her eyes, finally allowing exhaustion to claim her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Van Horn's anger, the town's judgment, the long work of building a life from scratch. But tonight, they were complete. A family carved from hardship, shaped by kindness, polished by love. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The weeks after Mary Grace's birth passed in a blur of healing and wonder. Grace marveled at how naturally Lincoln took to the baby, holding her with the same gentle certainty he used when carving his delicate birds. Thomas had appointed himself his sister's guardian, placing a new stone near her cradle each morning, protection stones. He called them. On a crisp October morning, Clara arrived with the news that shattered their brief peace. "Van Horn's left town," she announced without preamble, "but not for good. He's gone to the Capitol to meet with Senator Morgan. Word is he's pushing for new laws about vagrant children and proper Christian homes." Grace felt her stomach drop as she shifted Mary Grace to her other breast. "He won't give up." "No, he won't." Clara's face was grim. "But neither will we. The Reverend wants to perform your marriage this Sunday. Make it official before Van Horn returns with whatever legal trickery he's planning." Lincoln looked up from the wooden bird he was carving, a tiny owl, for Mary Grace. "This Sunday, unless you've changed your minds." "No," Grace said quickly. "We haven't changed our minds." But she saw the shadow that crossed Lincoln's face, the way his hand stilled on the wood. After Clara left, she found him by the creek, staring at the water like it held answers. "What's troubling you?" she asked, settling beside him with Mary Grace in her arms. "I have nothing to give you," he said quietly. "No ring, no proper house, no prospects beyond hunting and carving. You deserve—" "Stop!" She touched his arm. "What I deserve is a man who stays, who shows Thomas how to be good and gentle, who holds our daughter like she's made of spun gold. I have that."
But...
"Lincoln." She waited until he met her eyes. "I had a ring before. I had a house. I had all the proper things. And I was dying inside, piece by piece." "You gave me life again. You and Thomas. That's worth more than all the gold in California." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "I made this," he said, opening his palm. "It's not much, but—" Grace gasped. It was a ring carved from dark wood, so delicate it seemed impossible. Tiny vines wrapped around it, and in the center, a perfect miniature rose bloomed forever. "How did you, the detail?" "Months of work. Started the night you read to us first. Figured someday." He shrugged. Vulnerable. "Maybe someday you'd want it." Grace held out her hand, and he slipped it on. It fit perfectly. "Now," she said, blinking back tears. "Now I have everything." The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Theodore's mother had altered one of her own dresses for Grace, and Clara had woven flowers into her hair. Thomas wore his best clothes and carried a basket of his stones to share with guests. Even Mary Grace seemed to understand the importance, sleeping peacefully through the preparations. The church was fuller than Grace had expected. The church ladies had spread word, and it seemed half the town had come, some out of support, others from curiosity. "Ready?" Clara asked, fussing with Grace's hair one last time. "I've been ready since the day he carried me through that storm," Grace said. The doors opened, and Grace's breath caught. Lincoln stood at the altar with Reverend Douglas, but he'd transformed. His hair was trimmed neat, his beard shaped, and he wore a proper suit that Theodore had somehow procured. But it was his expression that stopped her joy and wonder, and something that looked like peace. Thomas stood beside him as best man, clutching a special stone white quartz shot through with gold. "For the ceremony," he'd explained seriously. "It's a forever stone." Grace walked down the aisle alone, carrying Mary Grace. She needed no one to give her away. She was giving herself freely and completely. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Douglas began, his voice warm. "We gather today to witness something rare and precious, a family already forged by trial, choosing to declare their bond before God and community." The ceremony was simple. Lincoln's voice shook slightly as he spoke his vows, promising to cherish and protect not just Grace, but the children they would raise together. Grace's own voice was steady, her promises coming from a place deeper than words. When Thomas stepped forward with the rings Lincoln's carved band for Grace, a simple gold band that Clara had mysteriously produced for Lincoln, he cleared his throat. "I want to say something," he announced. Reverend Douglas smiled. "Go ahead, son." Thomas looked at Grace. "You saved us. When we were in the cage, when everyone saw animals, you saw people. You gave up your precious thing for strangers." He turned to his father. "And you saved her back, fixed her house, hunted for food, kept us safe." He pulled out his forever stone, holding it high. "So I want to give you this, for the family we made from broken pieces." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. "Well," Reverend Douglas said, clearing his throat, "I think that says it all. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Lincoln, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, a promise more than passion, but in it, Grace felt all the words Lincoln struggled to say: gratitude, devotion, a love built from daily choices rather than grand gestures. As they turned to face the congregation, Grace saw various faces in the crowd: support from Clara and the church ladies, warmth from young Theodore and his family, uncertainty from some, disapproval from others. But none of it mattered. They were a family now, legal and binding. The reception was held in Clara's garden, simple but joyful. Mrs. Roosevelt had baked a cake. Mrs. Nightingale had organized food. Even Judge Carnegie made an appearance, offering quiet congratulations and a warning. "Van Horn's influence is reaching far," he said quietly. "He's pushing for a territorial review of all irregular households. You need to be prepared." "We will be," Lincoln said, his hand finding Grace's. As the sun set, casting golden light through the trees, Winston Churchill approached. The young marshal looked uncomfortable but determined. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I came to your home with assumptions. I've been watching since, and what I've seen—" He paused. "That boy trusts you completely. That baby thrives. And Mrs. Lincoln now stands taller beside you than she ever did alone." "Thank you," Grace said, surprised. Churchill shifted his weight. "I'm also here to warn you. Van Horn's been in touch with federal authorities. Claims there's still Indian unrest in the mountains. That you might be connected. I don't believe it, but others might." Lincoln's jaw tightened. "I left that life behind." "I know, but the past has a way of following." Churchill touched his hat. "I'll do what I can from my end. You folks deserve peace." After he left, the celebration continued, but Grace could see Lincoln's growing tension. When Mary Grace fussed, she used it as an excuse to step away, finding a quiet spot to nurse. Lincoln joined her, Thomas trailing behind. "He's right," Lincoln said quietly. "The past follows. Maybe I should—" "Don't." Grace shifted Mary Grace to her shoulder. "Don't you dare suggest leaving. I bring danger to you, to them." Thomas stepped forward, face serious. "Papa, remember the story you told me about the wolf?" Lincoln frowned. "Which story?" "The wolf who lived alone because he thought his howl brought storms. But the storms came anyway. And when the big storm came, he had no pack to help him fight it." Thomas looked at Grace, then back at his father. "We're your pack now. We fight storms together." Lincoln stared at his son, this boy who'd found his voice again, who spoke wisdom beyond his years. "When did you get so smart?" "Mama Grace reads to us," Thomas said simply. "Stories teach things." Later, as the guests departed and they prepared to return home, Clara pulled Grace aside. "I have something for you. Wedding gift." She pressed an envelope into Grace's hands. Don't open it now. Wait until you're home. The walk back to their shack, their home, was quiet. Mary Grace slept in Lincoln's arms. Thomas ranged ahead and back like a scout, occasionally returning to share discoveries: an interesting rock, an owl pellet, a late-blooming flower for Grace's hair. Inside, as Lincoln banked the fire and Thomas arranged his protection stones around Mary Grace's cradle, Grace opened Clara's envelope. Inside was a deed. Their land, all 40 acres of it, bought and paid for. The note was simple. Van Horn's not the only one with money and friends. This land is yours, free and clear. Build something beautiful. Clara. Lincoln. Grace breathed. Look. He read the deed, his expression cycling through disbelief, suspicion, and finally, a fragile hope. It's ours, Thomas asked, reading over their shoulders. It's ours, Grace confirmed. No one can take it. No one can make us leave. Lincoln sank into a chair like his legs had given out. I've never owned anything, never had. He stopped, overwhelmed. Grace knelt beside him, taking his hands. Now you do. We do. A place to build, to grow, to raise our children without fear. Our children, he repeated, plural. She smiled. Thomas, Mary Grace, and whoever else comes along. More babies. Maybe, but also. She glanced at Thomas. There might be other children who need what Thomas needed. A chance, a family, a place to belong. Lincoln lifted her hands, kissing each palm. How did I find you? You didn't, Thomas said. Mama Grace found us, with her ring and her courage. He yawned hugely. Can we read now? It's wedding night, but we still read, right? And so they did. Grace read from Shakespeare while Lincoln carved and Thomas arranged stones and Mary Grace slept. It was a wedding night unlike any in the poetry books, but it was theirs quiet and complete and threaded through with the small miracles of daily love. When Thomas finally dozed off, Lincoln carried him to bed. Grace watched the careful way he tucked the boy in, the gentle kiss to his forehead, the moment of silent gratitude. He's right, you know, she said when Lincoln returned, about the wolf story. I made that up to help him sleep one night. Doesn't make it less true. She touched his face. You're not alone anymore. None of us are. He caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. I love you. I should have said it at the church, but the words... I know. You've been saying it all along, in fixed roofs and carved roses, in the way you hold our daughter, in staying when running would be easier. She smiled. But it's nice to hear the words too. Then I'll practice, every day until they come easy. He pulled her close. I love you, Grace Lincoln. I love our family. I love this life we're building from broken pieces and hope stones. Outside, an owl called, and another answered. Inside. The fire crackled warm. Mary Grace stirred but didn't wake, and in their marriage bed, just their old bed with new promises, Grace and Lincoln held each other and marveled at the mystery of finding home in unexpected places. Tomorrow would come with its challenges. Van Horn would return. The federal authorities might investigate. Winter was coming, and they'd need to prepare. But tonight, they were married. They owned their land. Their children slept safe. And love built slowly from trust and daily kindness wrapped around them like a quilt stitched from all their careful choices. It was, Grace thought as sleep finally claimed her, more than enough for any lifetime. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed their 40 acres into a paradise of wildflowers and possibility. Grace stood in the doorway of their new cabin built with the help of neighbors over the winter, watching Thomas teach Mary Grace to walk at 14 months. She was determined but unsteady, gripping her brother's fingers with fierce concentration. That's it, Mary, Thomas encouraged. One more step. Lincoln emerged from the barn he'd raised with Theodore's help, carrying fresh eggs. The chickens had been Clara's gift, practical as always. He'd adapted to farm life with the same quiet competence he'd brought to everything, though Grace still caught him gazing at the mountains with distant eyes sometimes.
Letter came,
he said, holding up an envelope. From the capital. Grace's heart sank. They'd been waiting for Van Horn's next move, enjoying the peace but knowing it was temporary. She took the letter with trembling hands. But when she opened it, she gasped. It's from Senator Morgan himself. He's withdrawing support from Van Horn's petition. What? Listen to this. After careful consideration and numerous testimonies from respected citizens regarding the Lincoln family, I find no merit in Mr. Van Horn's concerns. Furthermore, accusations have surfaced regarding Mr. Van Horn's business practices, specifically the illegal imprisonment and sale of free men. She looked up. Someone's been investigating him. Lincoln took the letter. Reading it slowly, his reading had improved dramatically over the winter. Who would do that? The answer came that afternoon when Winston Churchill rode up, no longer a green marshal but a seasoned lawman with authority in his bearing. Folks, he said, dismounting. Thought you should hear it from me first. Samuel Van Horn was arrested this morning. Turns out that auction where you bought Lincoln and Thomas completely illegal. Those weren't criminals or vagrants, they were travelers Van Horn's men ambushed and kidnapped. Grace sank into the porch chair Lincoln had carved for her. All this time. He's been running the scheme for years, selling men to work camps, pocketing the money. Would have kept going if he hadn't gotten greedy and come after you folks. Churchill accepted the water Grace offered. Judge Carnegie's been building a case. Your situation made him start digging deeper. What happens now? Lincoln asked. Van Horn's looking at federal prison. His assets are being seized. And Churchill smiled. There's a reward for exposing the scheme, split between everyone who helped bring him down. Your share should be enough to see you comfortable for a good while. After Churchill left, they sat in stunned silence. Mary Grace toddled between them, babbling happily, unaware her world had just shifted. It's over, Grace whispered. Really over? No, Lincoln said softly. It's beginning. He was right. With Van Horn's shadow lifted and money to invest in their land, they flourished. Lincoln's carvings found buyers across the territory. Grace started a small school, teaching reading to children whose families couldn't afford the town school. Thomas grew strong and confident, his voice clear and sure. By summer, their family had grown again, not through birth, but through choice. A widow passing through with 2 young daughters, desperate and near starving, found shelter that became home. An orphaned boy from the mining camps, caught stealing bread, found justice tempered with mercy and a place at their table. We're getting crowded, Lincoln said one evening, surveying their expanded household. The original shack had become a chicken coop. The cabin had sprouted additions. Children's laughter filled the air where silence once reigned. We'll build bigger, Grace said. Mary Grace on her hip and another baby, their son James, growing within her. Clara says the territory's offering land grants for established families. We could claim the whole valley. A proper ranch. A home, she corrected, for anyone who needs one. Thomas, now 8 and tall for his age, looked up from teaching the newest child, a silent Apache boy named Joseph, to carve. Like we needed one. Exactly like that. That night, after the children were asleep, Grace and Lincoln walked to the hill overlooking their land. The moon was full, painting everything in silver. From here, they could see the lights of their home, the dark shapes of the barn and gardens, the creek glinting like a ribbon of stars. Remember the first night? Lincoln asked. You, me, and Thomas in that broken shack, sharing beans and silence. I remember. Grace leaned into his warmth. You wouldn't speak. Thomas wouldn't speak. I talked to myself just to hear words. Now we can't get a moment's quiet, he said, but his voice was full of affection. Grace pulled something from her pocket, a smooth stone with a hole through its center. Thomas's seeing through stone. which she'd carried since that terrible day before the festival. "He was right," she said, holding it up to the moon. "You can see through the scary to the other side." Lincoln took the stone, peering through it at their land below. "What do you see?" "Home, family, a future we built from nothing but hope and stubbornness." She turned to him. "What do you see?" He lowered the stone, looking directly at her. "The woman who saved us all, who saw worth where others saw waste, who gave up her ring for strangers and got a universe in return." "We saved each other," Grace corrected. "Maybe, but you started it." He pulled her close. "That day at the auction, when you stood up and bid, I thought you were either the bravest or the most foolish woman I'd ever seen. And now I know you're both, and I thank God for it every day." They stood together, watching clouds drift across the moon. Somewhere, an owl called. From the house came the sound of a baby crying, quickly soothed, probably by one of the older children. They'd learned to care for each other, this patchwork family built from society's discards. "The territory wants to use us as an example," Grace said, "of what's possible when people work together regardless of differences. They want to write about us in the newspapers." Lincoln groaned. "Haven't we had enough attention? This would be good attention. Maybe it helps another family like ours. Maybe it changes how people think." He considered this. What would they write? Grace smiled. "The truth? That a widow with nothing gave her last valuable possession to free a man and boy from a cage. That the man rebuilt her home and her faith in equal measure. That the boy found his voice and used it to speak hope. That together they created something beautiful from ashes." "You make us sound like heroes from your books." "Aren't we?" She took the stone back, holding it up. "We saw through to the other side. We chose love over fear. We built family from fragments. If that's not heroic, what is?" Lincoln kissed her forehead, then her lips, gentle and sure. "When you put it that way." They walked back home hand in hand, feet sure on the familiar path. Inside, warmth and light waited. Children who would wake tomorrow ready to learn and grow and challenge the world's narrow definitions of family. On the porch, Grace paused. There on the step sat a new stone white as snow, perfectly round, a gift from Thomas or one of the other children. She picked it up, adding it to her collection. "What kind of stone is this one?" Lincoln asked. Grace held it to her heart, thinking of all they'd built, all they'd survived, all the love that had grown from such unlikely seeds. "A foundation stone," she said, "for everything that comes next." Lincoln opened the door, spilling golden light into the darkness. From inside came the sounds of home, a baby's coo, children's whispered conversations, the creak of rocking chairs, and the whisper of turning pages as someone read aloud. "After you, Mrs. Lincoln," he said with a slight bow. "Together," she corrected, taking his arm. And together they entered their home, built not from wood and stone alone, but from every choice to stay, to hope, to see strangers as family waiting to be discovered. The door closed behind them, but the light glowed warm through windows, a beacon in the darkness for any soul still searching for where they belonged. Above them, stars wheeled in their courses. Below them, the earth held firm, and between heaven and earth, in a cabin that had grown from a shack, a family that had grown from sorrow lived there happily ever after, not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth every struggle that had brought them home. The stones on the mantel worry stones and hope stones. Seeing through stones and foundation stones caught the firelight and held it, like promises carved in mineral memory. And in the warmth of that light, surrounded by the family they'd chosen, and who had chosen them in return. Grace and Lincoln knew that some trades were worth more than gold. Love was one, family was another, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got both for the price of a single wedding ring, given with courage when courage was all you had left to give. It was, they knew, the best bargain either of them would ever make. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. I hope Grace and Lincoln's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts about this tale of love, family, and second chances. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more tales from the American frontier. And don't forget to hit the like button and the hype button to help more people discover these stories of courage and hope from the Old West. Until next time, partners.